Welcome to the Foreign Press Podcast. I'm Ana Swanson. I cover international trade for the New York Times, and I'm delighted to be here moderating the podcast today. My guest today is Mr. Merle Hinrich, the founder and chairman of the Hinrich Foundation. Mr. Hinrich, thank you so much for being here with us on the Foreign Press Podcast.
I'm delighted and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Looking forward to our discussion today. So, you wrote an article recently about the statements that came out of the visit that President Trump made to China in May. Could you just tell us a bit about that article to kick us off?
Um, Certainly. So there was a lot of fanfare regarding the meeting, and thank heavens the meeting took place. But the outcome of the meeting described, I guess, different stages or the possibility of different bargains or different views that each of the two parties had, which was, I considered, unfortunate. Um, and there could have been more specificity in what that outcome actually represented as trade. But it seemed to be a record of conversation that was formed for domestic consumption purposes on both sides. The Chinese framed it in a way that would be appropriate to their domestic community, and the US framed it for their community. So it was rather political, and it was not, it was fortunate they had that meeting, but the outcome as far as trade was concerned was really quite questionable.
Right. And so you said that Washington's readout presented this as kind of a win. It emphasized deals, right? This creation of a trade and investment board, sales of Boeing aircraft. Whereas the Chinese presentation is a little different. So it stressed positive outcomes, mutual respect, equal mutual benefit. So just talk a little bit more for us about what you think both sides were after there, and what are the different goals that Washington and Beijing were bringing to this meeting.
Um, the goals, of course, were what each side, the positions that each side would take. But I think you put your finger on it. For example, with regard to aircraft, Washington was talking about 200 Boeing aircraft that would be purchased or valued of something $17 billion. But Beijing mentions aircrafts and agriculture trade, but gives absolutely no aircraft quantity, for example, or no dollar amount, or no annual minimums. So that was true not only for this category of product, but it was also true for things in terms of the rare critical minerals. It was true in terms of agriculture. And so the outcome of this was not really, from a trade perspective, not really terribly beneficial. Now, maybe simply understood, and that there was no intent. This was the intent of this discussion, was for the two parties at a very, very high level to come together to discuss larger geopolitical positioning that trade was either detracting from or adding to.
Right. And the two sides do have a series of meetings later this year. So it seems possible this was kind of a warm up in some respects, right? Not necessarily the moment where, both sides would show all their cards and commit to everything, maybe more of an opening kind of gambit in the relationship. Would you agree with that or not?
Yes, it was a positioning meeting,
Mhm.
but those type of meetings typically do not take place when you have the two heads of each country meeting. Those are meetings which would take place at a much lower level to prepare. So as we said, it was, you would have expected far more, as I said in the beginning, much more specificity on indeed what what the packages would include. That there would be, so I think the outcome of the where do we go from here is
Mhm.
commitments do they look to achieve? What actions that they wish and hopefully will take? What exact quantities? We have to get to that point to make this a beneficial uh, trade discussion for both parties.
Definitely. And so I do want to talk more about the meeting and where you think the relationship is headed. But first, just let's just step back a bit. So I wanted to ask you about the role that trade has traditionally played in the U.S.-China relationship. I know that you yourself have had a long career in business in Asia. How have you seen trade between U.S.-China evolve, and how would you describe the situation today in comparison to that history?
Well, it wasn't until China um, ascended to the membership of the WTO in 2001 that things really started to change. But as you know, that there were some 15 years prior to that of negotiations for China's entry into the WTO. And the critical part of that was for China in particular to receive the most favored nation status, where they would not be looking at the Congress would not be looking at that every year as to whether or not that they would extend it because it would be permanent and it would be institutionalized. But as you know, I'm going to basically summarize this. In the initial few years, um, basically the West provided the demand for Chinese exports. And those exports were derived not just from Chinese entities, but they were derived from major foreign directed investments of multinational companies, everyone from M&M the to Caterpillar to HP to all of the majors, including the auto industry as well. So these multinationals, both European, Japanese, and American, invested heavily in China for two primary reasons. One is to improve, of course, the cost efficiency, initial cost efficiency, taking advantage of a low labor market price, and ultimately benefiting from the market that China was supposed to represent for these companies. Western governments, basically both European and American, actively encouraged their companies, their multinationals, to invest in China, or it didn't encourage it; they sort of ignored it, and it continued to expand. So we are now faced. So that what we're faced with is that if we can characterize China as a student of these multinationals, we brought capital, they brought intellectual property, either by choice or by force, if you wish. They brought management, they brought distribution channels to China. What happened, of course, is that the Chinese learned how to manufacture all of the product and also the byproducts of these various industries and went from being a student basically to being the leader in these industries. And now what we have oversupply. So the reality today of 2026 is the situation where China basically produces more efficiently at better costs, largely or in part because of the state operated enterprise access to capital, or I should say the state's subsidies, um, which have benefited both the shipping industry, the shipping manufacturing industry, the auto industry, the solar industry, wind industry. There are many industries which would never have reached the competitive level that they have had or that they have today if they would not have had the state support that they have. Now, on the other hand, of course, after China had agreed to many changes in their economy that the West did not hold, and WTO really was not structured in a way to maintain or manage the the, the evolution of that agreement. So there were a lot of things which were not fulfilled in intent or spirit. The telecommunications industry, for example, certainly in the financial industry. So we have today an environment with which is an oversupply from China. We have a situation where it has become very geopolitical, and the economies have become increasingly bifurcated.
Yeah, that's a it's a very good explanation. So people have often said that business was the ballast in the U.S.-China relationship. That was kind of the statement for many years, decades. Now, of course, as you're saying, the Chinese annual trade surplus is over $1 trillion, just a really stunning amount of exports that are flooding global markets. Chinese companies are incredibly competitive. Given this competitive and strategic threat from Chinese industries, do you think that businesses are still kind of a ballast in the relationship, or is it a different situation, kind of depending on the business, depending on the market? What is the role that they're playing right now?
Well, for more than a decade, the multinationals were lobbying the U.S. Congress, of course, administrations, to sustain the relationship for very self-serving reasons. Improved profit, taking advantage of a lower cost manufacturing base. It served the political interests of both the US and Europe as it kept consumer prices down. It was deflationary. So it was of benefit politically to the US, and it was of benefit to the multinationals that were heavily dependent upon what they had depended upon for their manufacturing. And I'm talking about major industries. And the pharmaceuticals are one of them. So we are in a situation with both countries, with which is a problem which they both self-created. They're
Hmm.
mutual. The environment in the U.S. has been caused by the lack of political foresight and the lack of defaulting to multinationals with unquestionable influence on every administration since Nixon and probably before.
And where do you see this headed in terms of, decoupling? I mean, the US and China have so many tensions and strategic risks in this relationship, but there's still a lot of mutual dependency. Where do you see that relationship headed?
there, there are going to be three outcomes of this, in my view. One, of course, is the Western strategy, and we could probably characterize it as a tariff fortress. And Europe is headed that way. The U.S. is definitely headed that way, whether you're on the right or you're on the left, protecting industries, whether it be national defense industries or whether it be more critical industries like the pharmaceutical industry. Um, they need a level of protection. Now, how do you protect industries? You protect industries either through subsidies, which requires some form of industrial policy, or you use tariffs, and you protect them from external competition. And in this case, China is by far the largest competitor and threat to U.S. and European industries that has ever existed. And this is not going to abate anytime soon. The China strategy, of course, is going to be to circumvent, to bypass. And one of those objectives will be to increasingly invest in outlet countries, whether they be the United States, or whether it be Europe, or whether it be Mexico that has access through the USMCA, to gain entry to the world's two largest markets and growing markets. So China will also dominate the demand certainly in Southeast Asia and Africa, because they will be producing the most competitive and indeed, in many cases, the most innovative and quality products in various categories. Auto industry being a good example. So the non-aligned countries will benefit from it, and countries, of course, that do not have that affiliation will not. The U.S. and European consumers will pay for increased cost, and it will be inflationary. Hopefully, that there will be other elements within the economy that can offset that inflation, the inflation that is caused by Chinese sourced product, but that is to be seen. The third, I think, sort of evolutionary process will be there has to be something of a multilateral approach. Maybe, returning to the WTO is not equipped to deal with this, but there's possibly an alternative multilateral organization that can be more effective at addressing the complexity of the situation and appease or to ease the circumstance.
And when you say an alternative multilateral organization, I mean, how do you envision that coming together, or where would that happen? Just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, it has to deal more effectively with the impact of the consumer. This is not just about cross-border trade, but global trade is determined by domestic issues. Whether the domestic issue, political, the domestic, just to step back for just a second. If you step back a few years, you can see how politics have played an increasing role in trade decisions, trade policy, and trade-related issues to today, where it is of massive consequence. So going forward, let me just broadly say both developing areas, let's call it the EU and the North American markets, represent the largest consumer markets, and the more flexible markets are the more, let's say, profitable markets than the third world would represent. So it is a market with which has substantial demand. The issue is what about and where do the consumers, or I should say where the workers, have some level of protection from the competition that represents. Mm-hmm. So a multilateral organization, unlike the WTO, but I would say, well, there's aspects of it that are very similar, but that are really very focused upon the balancing of the economic issues that face these economies. Because if you don't have the domestic support for cross-border trade, you have a problem.
So do you see, the kind of populism, trade skepticism that we have in the United States that has popped up in other countries? Do you see that as something that will continue until you have these kind of mechanisms to fix it? Do you think the pendulum is already kind of swinging back in the other direction? We obviously have a lot of opposition to tariffs in the United States as well. So yeah, where do you see that kind of that trend of populism headed?
Well, I think you put your finger right on the issue. Politically, what you're seeing in Europe, populist movements, etc., what you're seeing in the United States is an outcome, or in part, an outcome of not having adequately addressed the international trading issues. And we have to be able to address these problems politically in a democratic environment through the toing and froing. And I'm sorry to say this, but I think that the pendulum has, needless to say, gone far too far, and will probably have to return to a more normal, focused benefits to the overall economies of these areas. So I do not have a political answer to your question, Adam,
Mm-hmm.
and see that it is evolutionary. And until we get to some, and there will be pain, it will be painful to get back to that balance because of the influence, the international influence of China on these economies.
Right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I just wanted to go from that kind of framework back to thinking more about the US-China relationship, right? What role do you think US and China can specifically play to deal with some of these global imbalances that are being, proving so disruptive for people, right? Do you think that the two countries are kind of adequately stepping up in their relationship to deal with what the real trade problems are here, or is there another path that needs to be taken going forward?
One, I don't have a crystal ball.
That would be very
Two,
interesting for the episode, though, right? But
and two, I think the level of distrust that exists um, is palatable,
hmm,
unfortunately, and that it is going to take small steps. We're going to have to identify areas with which there would be far greater collaboration, commitment, and concessions made. And that may be areas with which is seen to have an effect on all mankind. I would say one, of course, is the need to address the viral problems, the COVID problems, the Ebola problems. These problems, if probably could bring together a clearly focused um, theme, central theme for both all economies and all political influences and all scientific minds to come together with one intent. But I do not see necessarily the collaboration at the automobile industry level today because it is hugely bifurcated. Um, it represents a major employment category, and there is a lot of political issues on both sides. As an example, there's many other industries that face the same issues.
And I do think it also relates back to your article as well. I mean, one thing you emphasized in your piece was about the situation of low trust between the countries, right? And the issue with compounding any distrust between the countries. So would you say that it's quite important to strengthen that foundation of trust? How do you go about doing that? I mean, how would you, if you were advising the Trump administration, how would you strengthen trust in this relationship right now?
Again, there is no magic wand to achieve that end. There has to be a willingness to do it. And that willingness would look to be absent. Look to be absent because both all are struggling for their political identity. They're struggling for the votes. They're struggling for their political positions. And this is causing serious issues of trust because it's much easier to blame a foreign entity or a foreign problem than it is to deal with your domestic issues. And both and all of them, every jurisdiction, I'm going to put it that way, has some very serious domestic issues with which need to be addressed before they can take on relationships. That's a very general comment, Anna, but I fundamentally think that there has been too much left to guess, if you wish, or self-interest at both economic and political levels that have jeopardized the ability to work together. and cross-border situations.
And there was a lot of pomp and circumstance and statements of friendship with the President Trump's May visit to China. So, but do you expect that kind of warm feeling to last then, given all of these tensions and the environment of distrust that you're describing? I mean, how long could this kind of truce last in this environment?
Well, in the public domain, there's this there's a theory of warmth and brotherhood and good feelings and intent. In practicality, there is votes, there is inflation, and there is huge bifurcation within the domestic environments with which need to be seriously addressed. I think that, as I said earlier, trust is difficult to build and easy to destroy.
Mm.
And it's going to take time to rebuild the relationships with justifiably in some cases are put into suspect. But it's going to take longer to recalibrate, yes, the global economy to support, of course, the domestic environment, but it's also equally important that the domestic environments in these various jurisdictions not only think, not only focus on the theoretical aspects, but focus upon the practical aspects of what needs to be addressed, which is not going to be always comfortable to get it right. Sacrifices are indeed going to have to be made.
And I guess I'll, in a moment, I'll ask you if you have any concluding thoughts. But I did also want to ask about the situation with certain critical industries. So it seems to me that one of the most notable events in over the past year was China's rollout of this rare earth export control system, you know, the kind of shockwaves that sent around the United States, the pressure that has put on the US. Where do you see those kinds of restrictions headed? And is that, you know, a force toward decoupling on both sides, or is it kind of, you know, evidence to both countries that we can't live without each other and we need to find stability and, you know, a stable economic relationship in some fashion?
It is a negotiating card with geopolitical implications, no more or no less. And until the geopolitical issues can be somewhat resolved, you're not going to be resolving the supply and the demand requirements of products from the rare earth to the issues of the automobile, the industry, or the pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you so much for your time. Do you have any closing thoughts to share? I know we covered a lot of ground. We went from, you know, very small scale in the US-China relationship to the global trade situation, back to US-China again. Is there anything that you feel we missed that you'd like to share?
I think we could spend a lot of time on almost every subject we've touched upon. So
Absolutely.
we'll leave it to your listeners to filter and work it out.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me, Mr. Henrik.
Joanna, take
Um,
care.
we appreciate you being here with us on the Foreign Press podcast.